Good evening. I am very pleased to welcome you to this online and in real life Politics in the Pub event, brought to you by Politics in the Pub at the Gaelic Club in Surrey Hill, Sydney, and by the mighty Consortium News. My name is Felicity Ruby and I'm going to be moderating this session. I'm speaking to you tonight from unceded Yuin land on the south coast of New South Wales in Australia. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of this beautiful and sacred land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I introduce our speakers who will address the case of Julian Assange, a clear case of Western political repression, the subject of our panel, I'm going to make a few introductory remarks and then I'll introduce and invite my panelists to speak to you tonight. First thing I wanted to mention is a new book that was released in December called A Secret Australia. It's a book that I co-edited with Peter Chrono. This book explores what we've learned about Australia thanks to WikiLeaks. Because Julian is Australian, some of our book focuses on what his situation says about this case of Western political repression, what it says about the state of our democracy and independence and foreign relations. And while that's a pretty sad tale, quite a lot of it, many Australians are very proud that WikiLeaks was born in Australia and that this bold combination of journalism and technology was pioneered here and has brought so much innovation, such as the anonymous digital Dropbox, which is now routine and in many journalistic outlets around the world. WikiLeaks has also shown us the benefits of much more routine global collaborative partnerships between publishers to make the most of big releases. WikiLeaks has really shown the way on so many things. I commend this book to Australians, and I suggest also that this model might work well in other countries, gathering activists, lawyers, journalists and academics to explore what we've learned about Germany and France and Iraq and Afghanistan thanks to WikiLeaks could also produce equally rich volumes. The second point I want to make tonight is that we're right now at one of the most hopeful points in the campaign to free Julian that I've witnessed in the last 10 years of working on this. A most hostile and poisonous court in the UK refused the US extradition request. Yes, in a judgment that is terrible and quite dangerous in very many ways that I'm sure panelists will discuss. Still, there is a judgment against extradition. The court has received the US grounds for appeal and will receive Julian's defence team's response on the 29th of March. So here we have a window of opportunity that we must seize to convince the new Attorney General in the United States, Merrick Garland, to finally close this shameful chapter. And the third point I want to make is that there's a larger support base than ever. People who have been quiet or downright hostile are seeing sense in greater numbers. Political leaders are saying enough is enough. More unions around the world, supported by Julian's union here in Australia, the MEAA, are organising. More journalists from a broad spectrum of outlets are saying that this cannot proceed without terrible consequences for their profession. More and more human rights activists and lawyers and the general public agree that this journalist and technologist, this Australian, should not be in a cage in Belmarsh Supermax prison in London for publishing. And if you consider the concerted waves of disinformation and psyops from very large, well-resourced intelligence agencies and their contractors and collaborators, their mischief makers and provocateurs, this is more of an achievement than we might give ourselves credit for, also because people are very tired after 10 years of campaigning. And the final point I want to make is about this fatigue. Besides Julian, the people who are the most tired are Julian's family, who have demonstrated such strength and resolve and who have been tireless in their campaigning. We've all been informed and guided these last 10 years by the enduring courage of Christine Assange, Julian's mother, and the clarity of her distilled facts and reminders to please be factual, polite and encouraging in your advocacy for her son. Right now, John Shipton, Julian's father, is doing a tour of towns from Melbourne to Sydney and then to Canberra. Julian's brother, Gabriel, is spending a lot more time on the campaign, and Stella Morris, Julian's partner, is ceaselessly working to bring him home to their children. We would be well served to be supporting them as much as we can, and also to be inspired by them to act now and to seize this moment with both hands. to have ideas and to implement them, however small and however ambitious. I'm now very pleased to introduce members of the panel. Our first speaker tonight will be Scott Ludlam. He's a former Australian senator for the Australian Greens, and he served in the Senate from 2008 to 2017, and he was deputy leader of the Australian Greens from 2015 to 2017. He campaigned ceaselessly throughout his time in the Parliament to support WikiLeaks, and he's also coming out with a very wonderful book quite soon. Look out for it, because it also includes discussion of the power of WikiLeaks. We will then hear from some of the mighty doctors for Assange, Professor Thomas Schulze and Bill Hogan, who have worked to advocate for awareness of Julian's health. And they will discuss why the judgment that found against extradition on health grounds was right. The next speaker will be Joe Lauria, who's with Consortium News, and he'll give an eyewitness account of the case. Consortium News monitored like a very difficult case given COVID restrictions and terrible technology. Consortium News was among a handful of outlets that covered the case very, very well. And he has quite a lot of insight into the Espionage Act and will be a very interesting speaker tonight. We'll also hear from Nigel Parry, who will provide an insider story of the unredacted cables by the first journalist to decrypt them. Parry's investigation with media partners is fascinating. He co-founded the Electronic Intifada and has been working in other areas, and he will speak on the impact of Julian's work. And then we'll have some free discussion among the panelists, and after that some Q&A from our YouTube audience, but also from the In Real Life Politics in the Pub in Sydney. So I'd now like to hand it over to Scott Ludlam, our first speaker for tonight.
Hey, good evening, and thank you, Felicity. Thanks to the organisers and everybody for bringing us together. I'm also speaking to you from unceded Yuin country on the south coast of New South Wales. And I'd also like to give a plug for this remarkable book, A Secret Australia. The book is a great read for this campaign, and it's also a great reset for two reasons in particular that I'd like to speak to. One is that it focuses on the purpose of the work. The book focuses on what was it that we learned from the publications that WikiLeaks made possible. What did we learn from the publications that people have put themselves deeply into harm's way to bring into the public domain? What did we learn about our country and about our world? All of us have been subjected to a decade of disinformation and misdirection to focus on Julian's character or on his socks or on his cat. And so the essays in here read to me like a reset switch. Even for people who have been around this issue for a long while, you will learn things about why this work mattered, why this work was done in the first place. The purpose of WikiLeaks, the purpose of journalism, is to help us understand how power operates when it thinks nobody is looking. The second reason I find this book really valuable is in its timing. It's being distributed now, right at the moment where we have our best opportunity in a decade to free Julian Assange. In the essay that I contributed, I talk a little bit about political repression and the purpose that it serves. Principally, repression is to provoke fear and to dampen social movements by making an example of people, whether they be high-profile people or just ordinary people. And I feel as though I'm used to thinking of repression, and maybe most of us have been taught to think of repression as a thing that happens in Burma or in Hong Kong or in Saudi Arabia. But that's what this is. The purpose of repression is to make our allies go quiet. It's to make people avoid eye contact with us. It's to make the work that we're doing feel as though we're pushing it uphill. And that's what it is. They're attempting to destroy the reputation of the principles. It means we have to work harder, no. And so do those who've directed these, precisely the opposite effect. Repression can, and I feel as though that's our job tonight. And it's our job every single hour until our friend walks free. provoke and inspire defiance, and ensure that this repression is a failure. When Joe Biden was last in the White House, the administration had made a judgment, quite a carefully reasoned one, that it couldn't prosecute Julian and the rest of the WikiLeaks team without running headfirst into the First Amendment and every single media partner that WikiLeaks had worked with during the course of its publications. Trump and Pompeo reversed that decision. Trump and Pompeo are gone. A new Attorney General, a different political culture, different senior officials, different relationships with the liberal establishment in DC and across the United States. It is time for us to reach out now as Australians, as people with the unique ability to say that Julian is from here, is that he's one of us. It's time for us to reach out so that the first item on the incoming Attorney General's desk, and the easiest for him to resolve, is to free Julian Assange and end this assault on journalism once and for all. So if you're here on this call, or if you're at the pub, or if you're coming across this live stream sometime later, it likely means that you're already part of the solution, that you've already refused to submit to fear, that you're already feeling defiance, and that's how you've come across this thing. And so if you have a good idea, now is the time to put it into effect. The Labor Party is shifting, the trade union movement is shifting. Felicity gave us a range of factors that show that the ground is moving behind this campaign. That is the most important time for us to push as hard as we can. If you're here, reach out to somebody and let's get moving. Let's sprint for a month and get our friend free so that he can return to his family. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to participating as we go.
Great. Thank you, Scott. I was reminded that in between hearing from Scott and our Doctors for Assange, we're going to be hearing a clip from John Kiriakou, who is a former CIA employee who went to jail for revealing torture, not for undertaking it. So please, let's switch to the video now. Thanks, Kathy.
The New York Times did an expose in the spring of 2016 on one of the maximum security prisons in the state of California. And they talked about how the United Nations has determined that solitary confinement for any length of time beyond 15 days is a form of torture. Well, in the United States, we keep prisoners in solitary confinement for as long as 44 years. This New York Times expose in California was talking about a solitary confinement system where you literally have no contact with any other human being. When you receive mail, for example, you don't actually get the mail. There's a computer monitor hanging from the ceiling of your cell, of your 6 foot by 10 foot cell, out of reach so you can't damage it in any way. They'll put your correspondence on the screen for 5 minutes. You stand there and read it, and then it's taken off. And that's it. The only visitors you're allowed to have are your attorneys, and even they are restricted to once a month. You're allowed one phone call a month. It's monitored, of course, live. You're allowed 2 showers a week. Your meals are provided to you through a slot in the door. Every one of these cells, and I know this because I was in solitary confinement, every one of these cells has a small door at the back. And that door leads to a cage that's outside. Now, the cage in my case was another 6 by 10 feet. And so you can either walk around in a circle or in an oval in your indoor 6 by 10 cell, or 1 hour a day, go outside into the cage and walk in a 6 by 10 foot circle. That's enough to drive the sanest man insane. At this California prison, things got so desperate that prisoners were smashing windows and eating the broken glass just so they could go outside for medical care and speak to another human being.
Well, that's a pretty harrowing way to introduce the content that our doctors, Bill Hogan and Thomas Schulze, will address in our next speakers.
Doctors for Assange is a group of roughly 300 doctors in over 30 countries on all continents, so we're of international scope. What really spurred it on was, the removal of Assange from the Ecuadorian embassy in April of 19 and the subsequent finding of the Special Rapporteur on torture that Julian Assange had been tortured. And then evidence of that torture was displayed by Assange at the first phase. Well, not even the first phase of his extradition hearing yet, but at some hearings that fall. And so the first letter that Doctors for Assange wrote was to the Australian government, and then another letter to the UK government, and several letters since. And so we've constantly been advocating that Assange is tortured. He must be released from prison and cared for at a teaching hospital of a university, and that his legal persecution and the conditions in the prison are contributory, per the Special Rapporteur, to his torture. And the only way to treat him as a victim of torture is to remove him from his conditions. And then also when the COVID pandemic broke out, he's obviously at grave risk. Prisons are breeding grounds for infectious diseases. And, he should have been released on bail at minimum last March. And we wrote a response to that decision condemning it. And so that's been sort of the main message of Doctors for Assange in a brief history. We have 2 Lancet letters, in the leading medical journal in the UK and probably the world. And so that's our message, that's our advocacy, that's what we're insisting on and continue to insist on.
Thanks. My name is Thomas Schulze. I'm a professor of psychiatry at the University of Munich in Germany and upstate in Syracuse, upstate New York. And I came on board last year, middle of last year. I had been following the case more as a private citizen, I think, as many of us. But of course, as a doctor, I have a different angle from which I look at a case like this. And of course, I then learned about the work of Doctors for Assange, and I realized, oh, this is great, and I definitely have to support them. So that's how I came on board. And through the work, I learned more about this case. I learned about everything that had been going on in these 10 years, and what was really an amazing or an eye-opener was the report by Nils Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. And he's a well-respected figure in this field, and he himself said, look, I didn't want to go into that. I thought Assange was a kind of a strange and weirdo, and and maybe it was right that he was in prison or so. But then when he went through all these documents, he realized something is wrong here. And I'm not talking about any legal aspects. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm a doctor like Bill, and we look at that from we never really take an oath, but people think of that we take an oath, but there is an internal oath that of course we have that is helping people and decrying things, horrible things when they are happening all over the world. And in this case, we clearly see that there is torture, and the torture was reported. People say, well, how do you know? Well, we have the evidence from a respected person in this field, Nils Melzer, and he examined Julian with 2 experts who I personally know. I'm also on the executive board of the World Psychiatric Association. We have a section on the impact of torture, and the then chair of that section, the Catalan psychiatrist Pau Carezales, was one of the 2 who interviewed, who examined Julian Assange. So I know him. He's a very respected scholar in the field. And the other Dr. Nuno Vieira, I know him well also. He is also very well known in this field. He looks more at the bodily harm. So we have evidence, independent evidence, that there was torture. There is evidence of torture. There's psychological damage visible. And as doctors, we have to decry this. And this is going on. And what we are saying is, get him out. He needs to be treated. And it has been going on. I mean, 10 years of confinement within the embassy, which was not voluntary because he had to. You know, it's like an asylum seeker. He had to flee from prosecution. So, and the way he was treated there, there's sort of a medical neglect and surveillance and so forth that contributed to torture. And now the issue is, will he, in case he's extradited to these prison conditions that he might likely be under, is there a high risk of committing suicide? And sure there is. I mean, I went through the court document, and I think, you know, all these psychiatrists from both from the prosecution side and the defense, I think they agree there is a mental health issue. The question is how you interpret that. But I think there's more overwhelming evidence that these conditions that he would expect there would definitely cause, would pose a great risk of suicide.
Yeah, and certainly Assange is no stranger to special administrative measures and how torture detainees, or how terror detainees in Guantanamo are treated in the history of the United States. And given his publications, he's fully aware of the wretched conditions. And the fact that the judge in the extradition hearing, who was otherwise barreling down the tracks to agreeing with everything the prosecution said, held up and made a decision not to extradite based on mental health grounds, speaks not only to Assange's mental state, but just the absolutely reprehensible and horrible conditions in US prisons. As an American, you know, the typical American, I think I used to be fairly typical, you know, you're sort of aware of the international condemnation and shock that we still have a death penalty and that we imprison so much of our population. But I didn't fully come to appreciate just how bad it was until I read about special administrative measures as described by John Kiriakou and others. And so the one thing that the judge couldn't fathom was sending him to the United States because of its horrible, horrible prison regime. So that was an eye-opener, but also his mental state really is that bad. He's, you know, as Thomas so eloquently pointed out, this torture is a fact. It's a fact established by medical and legal experts. The two medical experts that accompanied Nils Meltzer examined Assange independently and then talked about their conclusions. So they both independently arrived at the same conclusion that day. The fact that Meltzer was even there was because an American physician, Dr. Sandra Crosby, was concerned about torture. She's also an expert in this area in assessing victims of torture. And so anybody who wants to try and dismiss it as, well, it's just bad, you know, nobody likes prison. No, this is much worse than that. This is an actual medically established fact of torture that has not been disputed. No one else who has done a medical assessment of Assange has come to a different conclusion or disputed the diagnosis. There is actually an international diagnostic code for victims of torture. So this is, you know, medically established fact. And also in the extradition hearing, we learned new things about his mental health. We learned he has a form of autism called Asperger's syndrome. We learned, and you know, a lot of the reporters hated to report on some of these very personal and private details of Assange's medical history. And so I, you know, want to respect that as well, but he was diagnosed with Asperger's and he has had a number of other symptomatologies that clearly established that his severe depression and his risk of suicide is high. And given his high level of intelligence and creativity and ingenuity, the judge was convinced he could indeed, and probably, and almost certainly would find a way to kill himself.
Yeah, I would just like to add, well, thanks, Bill. One important fact, I think in the non-psychiatric experts or the legal experts, they think, well, you treat it, right? I mean, if you have a high blood pressure, you take pills and that lowers the blood pressure, or you have diabetes, you take insulin, or, you know, keep diet, and that's it. Well, here I think the lawyers, like the prosecutor's side, they might argue, well, we can treat that. You know, we have antidepressants, and if there's psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, well, we give antipsychotics. Well, first of all, if it were that easy, no psychiatric patient would commit suicide under appropriate medication. Unfortunately, that's awful for psychiatrists to admit, but that's a reality. Patients with psychiatric disorders do commit suicide, even under treatment, because there is no magic, there's no silver bullet here to cure this. There's no cure. You can only control symptoms, but you cannot predict what will happen in one's mind. So the idea that you treat someone, you throw medication at someone, and that will remove the risk of suicide, independent of all the likely horrible prison conditions, is nuts. I mean, no psychiatrist would ever say, yeah, 100% guarantee there will be no suicide. And also, we have learned that there's a family history, and I do psychiatric genetics research. That's what I've been doing for 22 years. Two of his family uncles, I think, committed suicide. There's a history of depression. He was treated for psychiatric disorders before. So you already have a strong genetic background. You cannot remove that. Then you have the environmental, external factors, and they would be aggravated. That is the prison conditions that he would likely face. But again, I would like to say that any prosecutor that thinks, well, we can treat that, we have prison psychiatrists, just give him medication that will take care of it, and he will be, just a regular prisoner. That's sorry, that's not how it works. Because if that were the case, every patient that psychiatrists treat would never ever commit suicide, which is not the case.
And this is very important to note because the United States has announced its intention to appeal the extradition decision on this basis, that they can manage the suicide risk in various ways. So, they're almost certainly, I think they've already filed their appeal. I don't think the documents are public yet, but they're almost certain to argue that the severity of the diagnosis is exaggerated, and that they'll come up with some way to mitigate somehow the risk of suicide and mitigate the prison conditions in his case. Maybe they'll relax a little bit, but I got the impression they were going to double down on special administrative measures, which is shocking and horrifying. Under special administrative measures, as Kyriakou pointed out, you can't talk to anybody but your lawyers. Trying to get a message out to an unapproved message recipient, typically under special administrative measures, you're allowed to get a message out to only 2 or 3 people other than your lawyers. And if you try to get a message out to someone else, you can be disciplined severely. One detainee prisoner under special administrative measures tried to ask his son to tell his grandson that he loved him, and that's not allowed. So this is how inhumane and cruel and unbelievably wretched special administrative measures are, and that the United States wouldn't back off on that. Just shows how cruel and vindictive and hateful this persecution is, and just how unbelievably shocking a regime it is. It's hard to put in words.
Thank you so much for those interventions. and for the advocacy by doctors for Assange, the work that you do and the expert opinions that you've been giving with your white coats on just has a disproportionate impact, given the respect held for the medical profession, but also the standards of evidence that you are echoing. I have to agree with you, as someone monitoring the court case for a month, it was like really deeply shocking. I thought I couldn't be shocked anymore when it came to this case, but the descriptions of SAMS and of the facilities in the US, particularly the one called Florence, the inhuman and inhumane conditions were deeply shocking. And as someone who knows Julian well and who's visited him in Belmarsh, of course, it's upsetting to hear about his deterioration and his suffering. He is a strong person, but only the very strongest kind of people can withstand such a long suffering that he's endured. Okay, so now we'll turn to Joe Lauria from Consortium News, who similarly experienced that court case and has been a strong supporter of Julian for a long time. Thanks, Joe, for telling us what it was like to cover this case, and also some of your insights into the Official Secrets and Espionage Acts.
Well, thank you, Flick, very much for that. Thank you to Politics in the Pub for organizing this. And also to the doctors. Their input now is more important than ever since the appeal hinges on the medical issue. So we're really grateful for the work that they do. We at Consortium News support the facts in the case rather than support Julian Assange, and the facts happen to support Julian Assange. So and that's unfortunately not been the case for the mainstream media, which did not cover the case very much at all. We did every day enter the courtroom. Rather than go through all of that, I want to bring us back to the theme introduced by Scott about political repression. I've got a bit to say about that and put Assange's case in some very vast historical context. Unfortunately, there's nothing unique about political repression. It's existed in every society from the beginning of civilization. When an illiterate person in an ancient society looked up at a monument, they clearly understood who was in charge and what their place was. Since literacy grew, the elite trying to manage populations have tried to control press, cinema, and now even online media. And always they have been behind that, of course, was brute military and police force. In case the propaganda of the elite fails, there's always the police standing by and the military if necessary. What is unique in Western societies, in my opinion, is, especially in the US, has been how the public has been led to believe that there isn't any political repression in their societies, that it only happens in non-Western countries that are adversaries, particularly to the US, like Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, Middle Eastern regimes today unfriendly to the West. We've seen how the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia repeatedly gets a pass, or in today's Iran, China, and Russia. And of course, there are political repressions in all of those countries without any doubt, but pointing only to them by Western leaders when they do that or in their media, it distracts from the homegrown repression. Now, citizens in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, they were at least aware that they were being repressed. I think the reason why Western publics aren't can probably be attributed to the fact that this very more elaborate and developed orthodoxy that's imposed through Western media on the people in Western countries. The lie, for example, that the US is spreading democracy around the world rather than pursuing their geostrategic and economic interests. And in that pursuit, they commit crimes. But the media in the West amounts to a cover-up of the crimes they commit in the pursuit of those interests. And here comes Julian Assange and WikiLeaks to rip the cover off those lies of omission and to end the secrecy really that protects the powerful. So there should be no wonder why those powerful interests have been trying to get him since 2010. Also, I think because Western publics have been conditioned to think that political repression only exists in our enemy states, but not in our own countries, it becomes uncomfortable for Western people, particularly in the US, to accept what WikiLeaks has revealed about their leaders. And likewise, difficult for them to understand Assange and then to support him, understand the principles that are involved here. He's ripped the cover off a very convenient lie that we have wonderful leaders and we have tremendous democracies here and we don't do these things. Only the Russians do that, only the Chinese do that. And this is the great value, of course, of Assange's work, but also the dangers to Western leaders and the uncomfortableness for Western populations. Amongst you mentioned the Espionage Act, Flick. Among these tools of Western repression have been the espionage laws in the US, Britain, Australia, and other Western nations. They have not only been constructed, as we see now, to punish classic espionage, stealing secrets, giving them to a foreign nation, but also to repress free speech. I've been working on a piece now, I have to admit, for a year ago I started this. I've not been worked every day on it, but it's coming close to ending. It is a story that I'm writing about how Assange became ensnared by the Espionage Act, looking at the changes in both the Espionage Act and the various versions of the Official Secrets Act starting in 1889 up until 1989, how changes in the law, both those laws, have set the stage to get Assange. This is 100 years of changes. It's a comparative history in many ways of these two acts, and it's quite hard going because of the legal language, the purposely obscure and vague nature of these laws. But it's important because obviously in an extradition case, there needs to be dual criminality so that what Assange is being accused of doing in the US has to also be illegal in the UK. And the fact that the Espionage Act and the Official Secrets Act over time it became more and more similar has made that possible to extradite Assange. Now, yes, Vanessa Baraitser denied the extradition on medical grounds, which, as Flick correctly said at the beginning, is something to celebrate. Of course, her support for everything else in the indictment, including the Espionage Act indictments especially, is very, very troubling, without doubt. I just want to just mention two changes to the laws over the years. In 1950, there were two amendments to the Espionage Act, the so-called McCarran Act, and that just clarified that mere retention of documents and that communicating them by any person, not just a government official, is a crime under the Espionage Act. And now earlier versions of both the Espionage Act and the Official Secrets Act, starting from the 1911 U.S. Defense Secrets Act, which is based very much on the language of the Official Secrets Act of 1889, and then, of course, the 1917 Espionage Act, which Assange is indicted under, borrowed from the 1911 Defense Secrets Act and the 1911 update of the Official Secrets Act. The change in 1950, adding 793E to the law in G, made it much easier to get Assange. And in 1961, there was an amendment also to the Espionage Act, which changed the jurisdiction from just US territory and possessions and the high seas to anywhere in the world. That ensnared Assange, who is, of course, an Australian, and he was acting outside the United States, but he, according to the US, violated the US law, this Espionage Act, so they can go after him because of this 1961 amendment. There's an interesting backstory to that, which I could tell later if anybody's interested. So here's where we are. But Baraitser, very much had to rely on these repressive espionage laws and how they're the same. Fortunately for Assange's case, the medical situation that he had that we just heard about is so dire, and the conditions of American prisons are even more dire, that to combine the two, Assange in that kind of a system, even a British magistrate could not, in any kind of good conscience, allow that extradition to go forward. It could have been a way out for the Brits to wash their hands of this affair, but in any case, she did not allow the extradition, and we have to hope that those who support the facts of this case, that the medical facts, as we just heard, will win out, and the Americans won't be able to convince the High Court in London that he is not in danger. I wanted to say one last thing about this 1950 amendment that, as I said, made it easier to indict Assange on the Espionage Act. President Harry Truman actually vetoed that bill, and he he was not necessarily pointing out that he didn't agree with those changes, but the overall impact of this act was to set up a control board to go after communists. It was so, he said in his statement, in his veto statement to the House, that this would basically turn the US into a totalitarian society. So unfortunately, that veto was overturned by Congress, so it became law. And so there were crazy things in the history of these two acts that had Truman's veto not been overridden by the Congress, that perhaps Assange wouldn't have been indicted under the Espionage Act, at least under those sections. It would have been more difficult anyway. So I will last say that James Lewis, the QC, the prosecutor, turned on the very first day of this hearing, which began back in London in February of 2020, turned to the press and said, "This is not about you. We're not prosecuting the press. We're prosecuting a man who is not a journalist." And then you go to September hearing in London, and they basically dropped that argument after so many great defense witnesses tore apart that argument and showed that, in fact, the indictment of Assange on the Espionage Act describes, in its very words, the work of a journalist, getting a source, keeping a source's identity secret, asking for more information from their sources. This is what happens routinely. So they dropped that, the US did, and basically Lewis said, yes, he is a journalist, but under 793E, as I described, under the Espionage Act, we can prosecute a journalist anyway, so tough. And that's what stopped the Obama administration, Biden being vice president, from indicting back in 2020. They could do it. It's on the books. It's completely seems to be unconstitutional, butting up against the First Amendment. This has to be challenged at some point. Now, there are a group of so-called progressive congresspersons in the US, in the House, who have introduced an amendment to the Espionage Act that would carve out an exception for journalists. And this is directly from the Assange case. Nobody expects it to go anywhere, but at least there's an awareness that this part of the Espionage Act that does ensnare journalists has to be removed at some point, has to be challenged, has to be struck down as unconstitutional because it goes completely against the First Amendment, where government cannot make a law impinging the free press. And this is what this part of that law does. So it incriminates the work of a journalist, and Assange is the first ever to be charged under the Espionage Act for that crime. And I think that this is why it's very bad what Baraitser said in her judgment. But if Assange is not extradited on the medical grounds and he goes back to do his work, it's still a victory for the free press. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. I found that fascinating, especially about Truman. Who knew? I didn't know. I'm looking forward to reading your piece when it comes out. So thanks for persevering with that. Our final speaker tonight is Nigel Parry. Nigel has written in particular about the call between WikiLeaks and the Department of Justice, and some freedom of information has become available just in the last week about that, I understand. Anyway, welcome, Nigel. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thanks so much, Flick. I appreciate it. My name is Nigel Parry, and I came into this story a kind of circuitous way. I was working in the Palestinian West Bank at Birzeit University during the second half of the 90s. And it was very frustrating to live there and read the international media coverage, because what was reduced from AP would do 200 words that would say something like, Palestinians and Israelis clashed on the outskirts of Ramallah, and 2 Palestinians were injured and 1 died. And you'd spent 4 hours out there watching something unfold in front of you that was, you know, the reality of it was the kids who were throwing stones at the soldiers were way too far away to actually hit anyone. And the soldiers would, you know, use live ammunition and shoot people and then give each other a high five. I mean, it was that brutal. And it was mostly not covered because international journalists lived in the Israeli-controlled areas, West Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. Of the 700 journalists that were registered at the time with the Israeli government, I think I was the only one living in the Palestinian West Bank. You know, so that gives you an idea of what, you know, how just basic perception happens. And in September 1996, the clashes broke out between Israel and Palestine. For the first time, an armed Palestinian sort of force was there, the Palestinian Authority. And Netanyahu, who was also prime minister then, had opened the tunnel under the Al-Aqsa Mosque, kind of alongside and underneath it, and the clashes broke out. And on the first day, 263 Palestinians were injured in Ramallah and 5 killed. And I think 13 Israelis were injured that day too, and maybe some were killed. It was hard to see because we weren't on that end of the front lines. You can only speak to what you saw. And the walls of the hospital in Ramallah were covered in blood, and there was just no time to clean it because there was just this endless flow. I mean, you talk about how COVID can overwhelm a hospital. War certainly overwhelms hospitals. And so being an eyewitness to this, you really just wanted to do something about it. And we had learned to use the internet kind of in 95. And this is sort of September 96. And we'd launched Birzat's website. So we just whacked up an independent media website, what in those days was called an alt news website. And I think that was the first one from a war zone. Meanwhile, I'd been doing a diary. I mean, you wouldn't get away with this now, but birzat.edu/diary. I mean, literally off the university main website. And that it was amazing the attention that I got from outside because you were able to deconstruct those 200-word AP bulletins. And the internet is an amazing leveler, And so when WikiLeaks came out, I first became aware, I'd heard about them, but I first became aware with most people around the time they released Collateral Murder, which was early 2010. And that was stunning, to know someone had done that. For me, my instinct was, well, this is someone who's doing something a lot like we did. I mean, we felt we had no power. We certainly didn't own a CNN or a BBC or a New York Times, but we had the internet, and we leveraged that asymmetrical communication tool in the same way that WikiLeaks was basically doing it. I mean, there is a great need for a worldwide leaking platform that's safe and anonymous. And, I mean, the idea of WikiLeaks is fantastic, and it still is. So when the cables were released, the cables were released 2010, and initially just to The Guardian, Der Spiegel, and the New York Times, and they began releasing a bunch of stories, which was a sensible way to do it, because just dumping it all out of there, it would have just been chaotic reporting, and there was stuff in that that was important enough to merit, systematic investigative reporting on it, and that was a great thing, too. But at some point, Daniel Domscheit-Berg and Julian Assange fell out. And one of the sort of passive-aggressive ways which this disagreement played out in the international media was Domscheit-Berg began giving hints that there were these files out there of Cablegate that were unredacted. And later on, in another article, a month or so later, he intimated that the password was also on the internet. And eventually, someone, it's in the article. I mean, one of the things I was kind of thinking of doing here is a quick screen share here. This is the original article that was published on August 31st. And what had happened is 1 week before that, Freitag, the German paper, had said they had decrypted an archive of WikiLeaks, but it wasn't helpful because everyone knew it was already out there and they offered no proof. And this was what David Lee had done. This is like literally a chapter heading in his book. He published the password there. And I was following WikiLeaks very closely at the time because it was fascinating to me just seeing this thing, basically lay bare the American war machine. I mean, it was quite an incredible thing. And I had, every time a WikiLeaks book came out, I bought one. And at some point, Domscheit-Berg actually said it was in a book, I think. And I'd read them all. There's only one book that mentions any actual password. So I got this one out. And this is what I saw. Meanwhile, there are a bunch of people I totally kind of understand the addictive level of the QAnon thing the cult that people have got into. It's kind of like Pokemon, collect them all. And that's what this hunt had become on the internet. Anyone who was interested in WikiLeaks was trying to find both the archive and cables, and this mythical password. But it had already been said, and I had the book there. I mean, from when I read it, I literally walked up and got the book. And so one of these people said, "Look, there's an archive here with these strange files on X, Y, Z, you know." And I'm trying to. I think there's actually pictures of this stuff somewhere. We're looking at an internet archive of the website at that point. Sorry there, David. Yeah, here we go. This is when Krypton published it later. And so this torrent file, at some point, Julian Assange got worried that people were going to raid them. So they encrypted all the data from the releases they hadn't released yet and put them on BitTorrent file and turned them into torrents. So people could download the file but couldn't do anything with it until they knew the password. And this is one part where I say there is definitely blame on both sides, is that password that Assange gave on the thumb drive to David Lee should not have been used anywhere else. You know, I mean, that was a fail on WikiLeaks side. But publishing it in your book as a chapter heading is also pretty dumb. And so I tried that password on the last file there, GPG, and sure enough, it opened. And at that, I write about this in the article. If you go into the Internet Archive, nigelparry.com, you'll find this stuff. I'll put it on my Twitter at Flying Monkey Air. The link to this article as well. But the second it decrypted and I opened it in a text editor and started looking at the thing, that everyone had, why they'd been such, dicks about it, for want of a better way of putting it, And there's just this whole power associated with it. For The Guardian and Der Spiegel and the New York Times, they were basically guaranteed of scoops every day for the next year. And so for the cables to be out there and completely available and completely decrypted, obviously the cash cow is gone at that point. So the whole thing is a bit distasteful in my mind. Just because there were a lot of problems on all sides, and this didn't need to happen. It was a very basic computer security fail. Now, what they've done with Assange and the fact that even Biden's administration is still going after him is beyond me. I mean, this was part of an era which everyone, even in the Democratic sort of party, from which Biden is, sent, straight at bang in the middle of, realizes that the Iran and Iraq wars were bad things. So, don't punish the messenger. It's like what's next? He's gonna open up a case against Daniel Ellsberg again for the Pentagon Papers. I mean, it's old news at this point. It's done deal. And Assange's state, as the psychiatrist and psychologist explained so clearly earlier, I mean, I've spent time in jail, and it does something to you psychologically that's really hard to explain unless you've been through it yourself. You've just got no power. You've got nothing. And there's no point to it. You can't be, when he was in the embassy, at least he could be productive, but not in a jail situation. You don't have access to anything. You're lucky if you get phone calls. And for something which is your rights, as a legal visit, I mean, that's going to be a 4-hour, 5-hour round trip for you, or you get strip searched first and after. I mean, those kind of, that just does your head in, for want of a better way to put it. So I'm very concerned for Julian, and if they're going to go after him, I mean, are the New York Times, Der Spiegel, and The Guardian going to be added to the sort of the defendants list? Because there's levels where they would definitely, where they're trying to get Julian on is whether he solicited the leaks. And it's like, well, he put up a website called WikiLeaks and invited people to send him them. You know, anything he said to any individual after that is merely an extension, and that's no different from what journalists have been doing for years. So there's really no case there. And Biden really needs to take advantage of being able to dump one more thing, you know, that just shouldn't have lasted as long as it has. And I think the real key for activists in the US would just be to make that point to Biden, that it's enough's enough. It's gone on too long, and what was it Trump said, the cure is worse than the completely wrong metaphor, you know. Well, in this case, the cure is definitely worse than whatever disease Biden thought. And if he's going to call Julian Assange a high-tech terrorist, then he needs to look at the editors of The Guardian and the New York Times and Der Spiegel, because they publish the same information. And, you know, it's like Manning has paid a hard price for it at the time, and now Chelsea. And she's like, she paid the price for this. You know, it was Julian Assange didn't sign any contracts with the US Army. And, you know, Chelsea paid a hard price and continues to. So enough's enough. We just need to press the wrap it up button on this, because if it goes through to the final conclusion and there is actually some extradition and there is some court case against Assange, the legal implications in America are awful. And if you've been living in America in the last few years, I know it must look strange from outside, but living in it is awful. I mean, even before the plague, halfway through Trump, I'm looking around at the people in the streets around me going, after this long, you guys, half of you still think he's doing a good job? I mean, there's some really strange social, psychological things going on in America that don't just end at the strange border of the QAnon cult. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, there's many people, you know, who study this way longer than I. But there's some basic American, I think, ideals and beliefs that are just kind of don't match up to reality. I mean, it's nice to strive for things, but reality is, you know, never gonna, you can argue with it all day, you know, gravity is gravity. And you can see that in the anti-maskers. I mean, did they argue with their mom about whether they needed to wash their hands after they went to the toilet? I mean, this is basic public health stuff. You know, and for it to have been politicized, it was horrifying. I mean, I grew up in Southeast Asia, and those cats had it down once they knew what was going on. I think it's gone up now, but for the longest time, Hong Kong only had 4 deaths. And if you compare the population of Hong Kong to New York City, it's similar. It's like 7.5 to 9.5. And basically everyone had already gone through it with SARS in 2003 and learned to mask up, social distance. And man, China, I lived in Hong Kong for 9 months, and Chinese people live like 8 to 10 to an apartment, in an apartment building that's 50 stories. I mean, they are not socially distanced in living at all. But man, they managed to keep it down to 4 deaths for the longest time. I haven't looked at it recently, but I mean, that's how you do it. And it's been really disturbing to just watch that. And I do think that's part of the Assange thing, is there's a general feeling, I feel like I've been walking around in Oz for the last 4 years. And that's part of this too. So I just encourage everyone to really push Biden's administration to just drop this. I mean, it's just not worth anyone's trouble at this point. And if Assange dies in prison or commits suicide or something horrible happens to him, he's not going to win any friends from his party. I mean, there's no benefit to this whatsoever. If he wins and Assange gets put away in an American jail, you locked up a journalist, it'll just start a whole other angle. So, you know, that would be what I have to say about it. Enough's enough.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, and also for your work on the Electronic Intifada, a fantastic source of information that was indeed using the internet as we all hoped and wished that it would continue to be used. So now I've been invited to just have the panelists ask a few questions of each other, just a little bit of open discussion among the panelists for just a few minutes. But there has been some questions posed in the YouTube chat channel, which I'd like to farm out as well. So one question that I have for our doctors is, you mentioned that your recommendation is that Julian be treated in a hospital when he is free, when we see him walk free, which I'm determined that we will, and in not too long a time. Can you talk a little bit more about why you would recommend a hospital? I have kind of fantasies of him being in nature in Australia and healed by some time in the bush, some time at the beach. How long do you think he would need to be in a hospital for? That's one question. Another one is, have you experienced much pushback from your colleagues for doing something that would seem to be a little bit political, as well as about proffering your medical assessment? How's that dynamic gone on? And but I'll invite my other panelists if they have questions to pipe up and ask each other.
Thanks. Well, it was fascinating to listen to all the speakers before. That you know, we are the medical guys here. We are not really the legal expert, but it was great to hear about all these things. So from a psychiatrist's perspective, a treatment of a mental health condition like the likes of what Julian is experiencing needs not only medication in a box, right? The box being the jail cell. He needs to be in an environment that is stimulating. I mean, psychiatric therapy does not consist only of medication. It's psychotherapy, it's additional therapies. It is a different environment. You need to get him this environment. This is the oppressive environment. I mean, the strip search, being caged, being shackled. I mean, again, he's not accused of any crime in the UK. He's there on remand. It's an extradition hearing. So this is torture, as we have decried. And because of that, he's suffering from depression, from psychotic events, psychotic experiences, and so forth. That needs to be treated. It needs to be treated in the right setting. As I said, and diabetes you can treat, you know, sort of at one level, like the biological level. But mental health, that's why a psychiatric hospital nowadays is no longer just an asylum where people are shackled, right? But that's what we have. A prison. I mean, there's prison psychiatry, and I think they're doing a good job. But in this special case, with these special administrative measures, that is detrimental to his mental health. That needs to be changed. That's why he needs to be treated in a different environment.
Yeah, I would say, you know, we're not saying he needs to be institutionalized, but acutely, you know, for a brief period of time, he needs to be evaluated. When we say he's sick, he's really sick, and obviously we would defer to experts on the ground actually evaluating him, but you know, psychological torture is not something that you can see your therapist once a month and take Prozac and that's it, and that's fine. It's serious. And so, yeah, he needs, almost certainly needs, given the severity of what we've seen and the reports, although, you know, you have to be careful, you know, diagnosing and treating by proxy. But, you know, it's almost certain that he needs some inpatient evaluation and stabilization. And yeah, I want to see him, you know, on the beach in Australia myself. Don't get us wrong. You know, that's the goal. That's what we all want to see. That's what we're all fighting for. That's what we're all advocating for. But, you know, as an initial measure, as an assessment and stabilization, you know, and honestly, to save his life, it's almost certainly, it's hard to imagine it's not necessary.
I just would like to add to your, you asked us also about how our field considers our work, or, you know, I think, you know, very often doctors are trying to be very non-political, but again, we are actually not saying this is political. This is a medical issue here, but of course there's a political dimension to it. It's about human rights, and I think you have many doctors who are active in human rights issues, more people are joining us. But I think there could be a little more, because this is also, and this is now not the medical doctor speaking, this is the citizen of Germany, but also the permanent resident of the United States. I love these. These are great countries, and they have helped spread democracy. And I just feel we need to keep it that way, and that's why we need to speak up. And I invite even more doctors to join our cause. I mean, there are many causes where doctors can be involved, like see the Uyghur genocide happening and so forth. So I think we need to speak out when human lives are endangered, and I think doctors will agree.
And if I could add my perspective on it too, this wasn't easy. This is the most politically active I've been in my life. This is, 50 plus years old, the first time I'm stepping out like this, seeing the absolute persecution and abusive process and dispensation with, due process and rights, and just how aggressive and just the white hot hatred that the intelligence community has for Assange. Yeah, it's scary, and but it has to be done. This is not right. This is an outrage. They're wrong. The Convention Against Torture, under which the Special Rapporteur has his mandate, it has its roots in the atrocities and horrors of World War II, and we can't allow ourselves to become what we fought in World War II. And I fear the more I look into it, the more I worry about that. So my colleagues almost don't notice, sadly. I do try to talk to them about it, but they're either disinterested or they're similarly afraid to step out.
I've got a couple of questions that have come in here actually from the YouTube channel. I might just plant a few of them. One question is for you, Nigel. What do you think the US is so afraid of if Julian is released? There's also a question here for Scott. Calling our representatives, what do you recommend saying exactly? What other things can we do? Scott, I'll let you think about that while I turn to Nigel to answer the question. What is the US so afraid of if Julian is released?
I'm not sure there's really anything for the US to be afraid of at this point. I mean, all the damage has been done. And what's happening now is the ongoing damage to America at this point is their relentless persecution of him. I think that's the issue here. I don't think there's anything for them to be afraid of. I think what's happened is at the time they reacted strongly, as if that would change things. And back in the day, I was covering all of this stuff just on my personal website, the WikiLeaks kind of phenomenon, and also what was going on with Anonymous and LulzSec. And there was huge crossovers with that. And watching, there was one weekend where I think 500 police department websites were hacked. And, regardless of the criminality of it, you have to just acknowledge that, wow, computer security is really bad, and those guys should have it together. I mean, that's law enforcement, right? So I felt there was just a general revelation of what was going on with the internet. Of course, later when Snowden turned up with, how much we're all being spied on, which is really hard to grasp. I come back to it. I go back to the Oliver Stone film with the actor Joseph Levitt, was it? The guy from Third Rock, because just the dramatization of it within 90 minutes is it's hard to grasp the extent of these things. So when you see people like WikiLeaks kicking against the goads, that's a big deal for a lot of people around the world. I mean, I live in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I'm in St. Paul. And when the George Floyd stuff popped off and that became international, I mean, people were protesting in Australia. People were protesting in every city around the US, Canada, Europe. It was, people were protesting in India. I mean, there's something universal about what's been going on over the last several years. And I think the US government just got into it. And once you're committed to doing that, and everyone's had other big bigger fish to fry during the Trump regime. So I think this stuff's been backburnered, but that's what I just keep coming back to is the damage has been done, and any further persecution of Assange is just not going to be good for America, or never mind, obviously not Assange, but definitely not America either. So there's no merit in it.
I quite agree. Thank you. And after Scott answers that other question, I will turn to the politics in the pub. You people who have shown up in a room in Sydney, we'll pass the mic to you straight after Scott.
Thanks, Felicity. I think if the question was about is it worth even bothering contacting our politicians, emphatically yes, especially now, because the campaign is starting to hit a critical mass. I think the comments that were made by Opposition Leader Anthony Albanese last week are highly significant. That's the strongest that we have had, the strongest break in bipartisanship that we've had in this case in a decade. That makes it safer for other Labor members to speak out that haven't had before of Parliament. It doesn't matter whether they are government, opposition or crossbencher. It's very quick to write to your politician and make sure that they understand that there is concern out there. So there are those formal avenues for participation, but we shouldn't ever constrain ourselves to that. There have been groups in the around the country that have done very highly visible and provocative actions. They've been doing that for years. Hang a banner, put a placard, do graffiti, make this visible, make it impossible to ignore, and don't ever think that you're alone, because you're not. There's huge support out there for getting Julian free. I know it's a bit cheeky, but I wonder whether it's okay to pop a question to Joe while we've got you on the line. Joe, you've been following these issues for years. You know a lot of the individuals that have been moving into the incoming administration. What would be your message to Australians? We don't get to vote in US elections. What would be your message to Australians? What kind of pressure are they likely to be interested in hearing from a loyal, I would argue vastly too loyal, ally? From our perspective, what do you think is going to make the most difference now?
Well, the Australians should vote in American elections. Basically, the 53rd state, I'm not sure, 51st might be Britain, 52nd Israel. The fact is, Australia needs to have an independent foreign policy and something in between, having good relations with China and the US, for example. They don't need to jump whenever the US says they need to. And this is the heart of the issue for me about the Australian political class, that they don't have the guts to defend the country's interests. And they, particularly in relations with China, we've seen the economic interests of Australia being hurt because the United States put pressure on them. Now, the Americans play a very dirty game, and they have enormous leverage. But one of them is just to not give intelligence to the Fifth Eye out here. And I think there has to be sacrifices made maybe by the ruling circles of Australia if they want to do what's good for the Australian people. And what's good for the Australian people is to support Julian Assange and not give lip service. As we just saw the other day in Parliament, Maurice Payne, the foreign minister, was questioned by an MP, and just platitudes about consular services for Assange in Australia. This had to be a major point that Australia needs to make with the United States to back off, that in general, this is the wrong thing to do. This is not becoming of a Western society. If we want to continue to say we're democracies, we're going to have to take a hit here. He exposed things, even about Australia, as your book, Scott and Felicity, Secret Australia has exposed, but mostly about the US. And as Nigel just said, the damage was done, although I disagreed, because if Assange goes back to work, I think he very well could expose more things. That would be the idea. So they want to stop him and make an example of him for others who might have similar ideas, like doing real journalism. So Australians, I don't have any hope that this party in particular that's in power, the Liberal Party, would in any way step forward and support Assange and stand up to the US. But if there ever were an issue that Australia needs to stand up to the US about, it is the Assange case, because it's a universal principle. It goes beyond economic short-term interests. And but I don't have much hope for that. I don't see Americans tuned into what Australia thinks of Assange. They are not very much tuned to what Assange case is all about, partly because the media has ignored the story for the most part, and they were drenched with disinformation, misinformation about Assange's role in the 2016 election, of course, about the whole Swedish episode. So there's been a lot of, and this was a purposely, as we know from that leaked document that WikiLeaks itself published back, I guess, in 2008, about the Pentagon having a program to destroy WikiLeaks and Assange's reputation and all the people around him. So they've actually followed through in that endeavor to destroy Assange's reputation, and that's unfortunately one of the things people who are trying to defend Assange are up against. And I know that there have been public opinion polls in Australia of upwards of 80 to even 90% support. I think it was 60 Minutes that did a poll here in Australia that said that many Australians support Assange. That message has to get down to Canberra so that they understand that this is an important issue and that they have the backing of the Australian people to stand up to the U.S., at least on this critical issue that goes way beyond the life of one man, Julian Assange. I hope that answers.
Thank you. Yes, very well. I quite agree with you on polls. So now we're going to turn to the folks in Sydney at attending Politics in the Pub. Have you got a question for one of our panellists? Please direct your question. And then I'm going to turn to Thomas.
Thank you very much. I think Scott Ludlam and Dr. Lauria have sort of stolen my fire a little bit. I remember back to 1999 where the Australian people stood up and supported the East Timorese. And that, as Clinton said, that was a big road bump. That road bump was Australia, and they had to change policy because actually Australian people stood up and forced the government to change its policy. I'd like to know, there are a wonderful group at the back here who demonstrate every week at the Sydney Town Hall steps, and they've reclaimed the steps for all of us. They do wonderful creative stuff. I just wonder if and they mentioned banners and banner drops and so on. Just wonder what other, I'm sorry, but the people from the MEAA don't seem to be here. But the question is, what other forms of effective pressure can we put on the government to stick up for an Australian citizen who has done a completely laudable and heroic thing, actually, and who's like Greta Thunberg, suffers from a condition that actually makes someone very much focus on something that needs to be focused on. Thank you. Just like Greta Thunberg. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that. I think Scott did answer like some of that question earlier. The kinds of things that people can be doing are directly contacting their representative, asking if they are a member of the Parliamentary Friends Group to bring Assange home. There's every reason to ask why you aren't a member of that group right now. It's a growing group. There's now 24 members. So there's the ability to communicate directly with your member and indicate that you vote and that you care. There's also opportunities to use social media to share content, to correct misinformation on social media. It's a pretty hard task, that, but if you can chip in and cheerfully and politely engage with people, that makes a big difference. All kinds of organizations exist that you can plug into, doing public work. Wearing a t-shirt, I find, and walking around an airport defiantly is, something that everyone can do. Support and be curious and use WikiLeaks and share information that you find on there. There's a variety of public, private, social media and in the streets ways to support. You can also give money to the various support groups that are around and directly to the legal team via Stella Morris's GoFundMes. Scott, would you like to add to that before I turn to Thomas?
Yeah, just one thing that's occurred, that if you find yourself with the enormous good fortune of being in a pub, surrounded by allies, surrounded by like-minded people, make sure you don't leave without introducing yourself to somebody that you don't know and sharing ideas. Share your ideas, listen to others' ideas. You're surrounded by the people that we're going to need this next little while. It's just, we need to build a greater social movement, starting with what we have, which is a lot. So some of us are stuck on Zoom calls you're all out there drinking beer, surrounded by allies. So please don't waste the moment.
Good point there. And you dear people in Sydney, do join on Friday evenings at the Sydney Town Hall, the wonderful people for Assange, a wonderful group of people. Thomas, you have a question.
Yeah, it's a question for all the my colleagues here, the journalists on and more politicians on the panel. I think there's this notion that now we have Biden and the Democrats and they're the good ones. Well, obviously they continue, but I would like to point out that there are many Republicans, also very diehard ones, like Trump supporters. I would think of more the libertarian ones, Ron Paul, then Thomas Massey, kind of a nerd, if you will, but they are the ones that staunchly, based on the principles of free speech, actually advocate for that. And on the other hand, like the Andrew Young, who was a presidential candidate from the Democrat side, he's now running for mayor of New York, I think. He says, well, Julian Assange has to stand for trial. So it seems to me that it's not like a clear-cut thing, Democrats, Republicans. And I think if you believe in freedom of speech, you will find many on the Republican side. So what's your take on that? Where do we see bipartisanship here? And is there more growing?
Who would like to take that, Joe?
I'll take that. I think you're right when you talk about libertarians, that they, while they, in my view, have some horrific ideas about domestic policy, they're pretty good on foreign policy and on civil rights issues, such as freedom of speech. So I think they're speaking from the point of view of principle. There are other Republicans who mistakenly, like Democrats, and that's why many Democrats oppose Assange, believe that Assange stole the 2016 election and gave it to Hillary Clinton, which is absolute, of course, nonsense, because the emails that were released by WikiLeaks that came from the Democratic National Committee, we know now that Sean Henry, the head of CrowdStrike, has testified behind closed doors that they had no evidence it was even a hack, and there was no collusion or conspiracy, according to a 2-year, $32 million investigation by Robert Mueller, all the way debunked that. Also, the night before the US election, November 2nd, the Mueller released a redacted document, but it showed that they could not go after Julian Assange. They never interviewed him in that investigation, but they had no evidence to go after Assange, that he was aware that, in their opinion, he was talking to Russian agents. But the fact is, those emails are true, and that's all that matters. It doesn't even matter who the source was. WikiLeaks set up a Dropbox, an anonymous Dropbox. That's now been copied by major media around the world: The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, CNN, The New York Times. Therefore, theoretically, the Russians could put something in CNN's box, and it could be turned out to be accurate and newsworthy, and CNN would publish a story and not know that it was the Russians who gave it to them. So it doesn't matter if the story is true. It doesn't matter who the source is. This is a completely irrelevant argument, but it was raised to a national crisis that Russia had interfered and tried to steal the election, et cetera, and Julian Assange was central to that. He was an agent of the Russians, et cetera. We know that story now. Many people on the Democratic side still believe that, and they don't like Assange for that. Even though this indictment and this extradition hearing and this prosecution has nothing to do with the 2016 election, only with releases in 2010, that message doesn't get through. It's still, there's a hatred for Assange based on those personal matters, as Scott alluded to at the beginning about his cat, the Swedish story, and of course the 2016 election. It's really damaged Assange in the eyes of Democrats falsely. It was Hillary Clinton's documents that showed there was corruption in the DNC. They tried to steal the primary election from Bernie Sanders. It's all there, and it's the doing her speeches to Goldman Sachs and the big banks. That's their doing. That the journalist reveals that they're not the criminal here. They're not the ones who did anything wrong. They've done their job. But unfortunately, it's become a pattern here that when politicians are exposed, they have a convenient excuse now to blame a foreign power for being behind it, and they get away with it. Even if the foreign power did hack that and leak it to WikiLeaks, it's irrelevant because the information was accurate and true, and that's what people should focus on, but they don't. And I think that's why Democrats oppose Assange. And a lot of Republicans who also believe that nonsense story may support Assange too, thinking that he did help Trump win. Why did Trump say, I love WikiLeaks? Because he thought it helped him win. Because they revealed what Hillary Clinton and her team had written in their emails, all the various things we know.
Okay. Is there a question there from the pub?
So I'm going to ask a few questions and I'll let you guys think about them before you respond. Firstly, if Assange won, what is there to stop more trumped-up charges to be raised to carry on more court cases against Assange? Secondly, what is the final court that ceases to draw out this joke? So, for example, if the magistrate said Assange cannot go to the US, would that be the end of the case? Or is there always going to be the chance where some new court will be raised and say, no, but we've got oversight and it's going to be drawn out forever? Next thing is, what flashback or ramifications are there, negative ramifications are there for the legal system for allowing this to become a bit of a debacle rather than sort of letting it go and saying this is enough and move on? And lastly, from the talk tonight, from all the speakers, I have a query in terms of when is it that the law seems to be enforced or is valid, and when does politics and playing games with issues seems to sort of override reality? When, as in, when are we dealing with things that are purely political and, if you like, social issues? And when is it actually the law applies and is relevant? Or does the law have to sometimes step back and say, this is not part of the law, this is more of a social norm or a social discussion? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Quite a lot of them are pertaining to legal issues, and there are actually no lawyers on this panel tonight, unfortunately, because I would like to be able to be authoritative when I say that if the US drops the charges, if the new Attorney General indeed says, I've got really bigger fish to fry and I've inherited a bit of a mess here in the US, and so I might let this one go, that would stop the charges free to both leave the UK and maybe even return home. It's impossible. It's a Nostradamus question as to whether there'll be other charges from another government or indeed other charges from the US. We just it's impossible to say for sure what the future holds, but those charges being dropped would allow Julian to be free. Right now, he is safe in the United Kingdom because the United Kingdom has ruled that extradition should not happen. But if Julian, for example, came home, then Australia might say extradition can happen. That's why it's important that those charges are dropped by the US, in the US, and then they cease to be active. As to your questions about when the law applies and when politics applies, well, there's principles and then there's reality, and I can't answer that question necessarily. Any other responses from panelists to any of those questions? If not, I'll turn to Nigel, who has a point to make about the UK. Does anyone else want to answer any of those questions? Go on.
Yeah, the first time the politics and the pub peeps were asking questions, they were saying, you know, what should we do? And it occurred to me, you know, I mean, I'm Scottish, I'm from the UK, but I've been living in the States for 22 years. And I don't think it really matters where you're from in this issue. So I think I would encourage everyone from anywhere to write to those three governments, to the UK to say, I mean, remember back in the early days when he was in that country house of that guy, you know, the ally. Why can't he be restored to a state like that, at least, where he's not in immediate medical threat, you know? That seems a very basic thing to ask the UK government. Just that one thing, you know? Also drop the charges, obviously, but that one specific thing. He can be on an ankle, you know, whatever, just get him out of the jail. And to the US government, you know, it's just got on too long. Drop the charges. It's not going to get any better for you guys from here on in. You know, and to the Australian government, you know, I think I obviously should write to both the UK and the US ones, but why not write to the Australian one as a British citizen and say, you know, I'm not that happy with what my government's doing. you know, you guys should be defending your citizens. So I'm basically encouraging everyone from anywhere to write to all three of those actors in this case and put pressure on them. Because it's at this kind of point where the thing is deeply embarrassing for America. I'm actually quite surprised they appealed that under the Biden thing. But there's also a level that, are we absolutely sure that that was not already, that kind of trajectory was already not in place from during the Trump era, you know, of choosing to appeal that. I'm not sure of the answer to that. Someone actually may know that, but
yeah, I do actually have a sense. I have a sense that it would have been highly unusual for an acting attorney general to halt a trial or a prosecution when it was so far advanced.
Yeah.
But in fact, that a new attorney general is the juncture where those kinds of decisions, that kind of pivoting and change of policy can be enacted. And indeed, at any time, the new attorney general can do so. But until March 29, when the defence arguments are being put in, we have this perfect timing to really build and mount the case. One of the emphases of this panel has been to take action. Doctors within their realm and with their expertise have been taking action and appealing to governments and providing information that we can all work on and appeal directly to the court. Consortium News and journalists have been, like Nigel, have been investigating and explaining and decoding and analysing the material that WikiLeaks has made available to us, but also the implications for a free press. And activists and advocates such as Scott and myself have been organising and communicating and writing and coming up with terrible memes is one of my favourite things to do. So within your realm, with the resources that you have and the ideas and the networks that you have, please have ideas and do them now. Reach out to others, meet, communicate, write, think, and keep on pushing until Julian Assange is free. He's free to come home if he wishes, and he's free to continue his work. He's free to heal. And we are assured that our democratic ideals might one day be realised of a free press and of an independent judiciary and of governments that seek to be and want to be accountable and transparent in their actions on our behalves. So I want to wrap up with those words and warmly thank my fellow panelists who've come in and beamed in from all over the world, including here in Australia, to be with us. Thank you to Politics in the Pub for the work that you do to make these kinds of discussions possible. Thank you so much to the magnificent work of Consortium News. May you keep publishing and keep printing and keep broadcasting the work that you do. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Politics in the Pub goers. Nice to see you there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity.
Thank you.
Yes, also, yes, read this book.